Welcome all on the third lecture from the series How to Shape the Future, which is accompanied with the exhibition Show Must Go On, presented in Warsaw at the Korean Culture Center. The group show of known Korean artists, and the concept of the exhibition is based on the very known gesture by Marcel Duchamp when he, using the method of ready-mades, and he recreated the small show in his suitcase. And the curator of the exhibition and the artists use this method to present the overview of their art practice and notion of their artworks. But the series of lectures were thought as a extension to the notion of the exhibition itself, and we looked so far into the concepts of cultural identity in Korea from very historical perspective, from medieval ages until 1910. And second lecture went more into details to the process of modernization and contemporary times. And tonight I'm pleased to welcome and host at the CCA Ujazdowski Castle Dr. Yhee, who is associated with the Institute of Korean Studies at the Freie University in Berlin. He is as well a fellow at the Friedrich Nietzsche Kolleg in Weimar Classic Foundation. In 2013, he received a scholarship at KHAK Foundation in South Korea for his PhD research. And I'm really pleased to host him, especially that he combined and connect the very notion of idea of multiculturalism between Western world and East. But tonight's lecture is very openly titled Consequences of Avant-Garde, but I, without further ado, would like to give the voice to Dr. Yhee to explain more, and I hope you will enjoy the lecture, and after that you are more than welcome to participate in Q&A or comments with our guests. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and to the audience, good evening. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here at the Ujazdowski Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw. I'd like to appreciate Ms. Konrad Schiller, the curator of this remarkable event, for his friendly invitation. My name is Yhee. I'm a researcher of philosophical and aesthetical thoughts, but also a political and diplomatic advisor on political matters in their multicultural and international constellation. In this context, I have been working not only in academia, but also with diverse political and governmental institutions, as well as NGOs in the recent years in South Korea and Germany. With these academic and working backgrounds, I would like to address the political, historical, cultural, and aesthetic aspects of the cultural identity discourses in Korea briefly, and show their relations to one another today. My talk today has 5 parts. Part 1 is about the westernization and modernization in Korea. The second part is on the early modern cultural projects in Korea in the late Joseon dynasty. And then it's followed by the third part, cultural projects or anti-cultural projects during the Japanese colonial period. And the fourth part, culture, arts, and the avant-garde in the colonized Korea. And to wrap it up, I will finish my brief talk by mentioning about political division and war on the Korean Peninsula. Part 1, Westernization and Modernization in Korea. I was kindly asked to provide a short presentation on one of two interesting topics. Originally, my talk was supposed to deal with the cultural identity and modernization in Korea, and then later I was requested to give a short review on the processes of Westernization via modern cultural projects such as avant-garde movement in Korea. Although the first topic was discussed at the previous session in April, I would like to allow myself to address this aspect of the cultural identities continuously today, even if my main focus will be put on the relationship between the process of Westernization and modernization in Korea in the political, cultural, and aesthetic domains. One of my reasons rises from the fact that the process of Westernization and its relevance to the modernization process in Korea cannot be fully explained without reflecting on their historical and political backgrounds, which in turn have influenced the entire process of constituting and reshaping the collective and cultural identities of the nation. The formulation of the other suggested topic seems also quite tempting itself. The process of Westernization via modern cultural projects in Korea. But some scholar might say that this very attempt to wrap up these highly debated ideas such as Westernization and modernization, as well as probably even colonialism and post-colonialism in a sentence, can be compared to taking a pleasant walk in a minefield. But I'm not suggesting that this topic is not worth our discussion. On the contrary, I'm asking you to pay close attention to the tensions these ideas are building up with each other, just like in a minefield. To understand it better, let us ask a few questions. Does this formulation entail the assumption that the Westernization process equals or can be regarded as the modernization process in Korea? If so, then we have a problem. As we want to distinguish these two ideas for their own sake, for we are required to offer a more specific definition of the modernization without referring to the Westernization in it, if we still want to be able to explain the nature of the modernization process in the Western civilization, such as in England, Germany, or even in Poland. Only then we will be able to avoid the logical fallacy of circular reasoning. So, in doing that, we might find some of various and also highly debatable keywords of the modernity, such as rationality, self-reflexiveness, individuality, autonomy, liberty, equality, humanity, human rights, and so forth. A more sophisticated theory on the modernity sometimes tries to identify modern practices, modern values, and modern institutions. Depending on which one of the newly established definitions of the modernization you follow, you might reach different conclusions on the modernization process in Korea. For example, you might find some indications of modernization process in Korea in its major era of the Joseon dynasty, which can be distinguished from the westernization pressure in the following centuries. Furthermore, you might want to identify diverse cultural and political constellations to understand their role for the changing structure and reception of the modernization process in heterogeneous period of Korea in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Especially for the last century, you might want to raise further questions to cover the aspects of the colonialism and the post-colonialism. It means that you might want to discuss more specific aspects or modes of the westernization process of Korea, such as its forced Japanization during Korea's colonial period between 1910 and 1945, or its government-led Americanization after the end of the World War II. In this way, I hope that I was able to indicate that westernization and modernization have been, strictly speaking, two different processes that, however, have accompanied and influenced each other in the Korean history in the last centuries. These were two interwoven processes. They played a significant role in constituting, reshaping, monopolizing, repressing, reactivating, and perpetuating collective and cultural memories of Koreans. Part 2. Early modern cultural projects in Korea in the late Joseon dynasty. The suggested topic also seems to assume that modern cultural projects such as Avant-Garde movement could have influenced, facilitated, or even led the westernization process in Korea. Before we take a further step into the aesthetic realm, let us first reflect on the question, that is, which projects are entitled to be cultural projects? Are we to search for the most decisive cultural factors, which were the main part of the mechanism of reshaping and relocating Korean cultural identities in the 20th century? We should look at the macro-sized project, often planned and implemented by the state powers first, before we limit our examination to the purely aesthetic domain. Here, I'm thinking of projects such as the emerging of new newspapers as competing modern media such as 독립신문 in 1896, 매일신문 and 황성신문 in only 2 years later in 1898. These privately published papers redefined or even replaced the function of the traditional and governmental periodical media such as 조보, dated as early as 1520, or 기별지, later 한성순보 in the 19th century. These new medias were important not only because they were typical institutions of the modernity, but also because they could channel and spread modern ideas and values in the last decades of Joseon dynasty prior to the time when the imperial Japanese invasion took place, culminating in 1910 with the forced annex between the Joseon dynasty, or later the empire of 대한제국, with the Japanese empire. So they played a significant role to the modernization of Korea, either by facilitating and accelerating the modernization process, or by introducing information and images from the Western nations and other neighbor nations such as China and Japan in their struggle with the similar task of their time. By various reports and sketch of the socio-political as well as cultural topics in international dimensions, they connected the outside world with the so far more or less self-sufficient system of Korea. Most importantly, they made the public clearly aware of the imminent threat by the Western nations and the militant Japanese empire. It is no coincidence that only a couple years ahead, the people saw the rise and fall of the Donghak peasant revolution between 1894 and 1895, which marked one of the first international conflicts on the Korean territory in its modern history. Part 3. Cultural projects or anti-cultural projects during the Japanese colonial period. It is an irony that not some cultural projects, but the wars that have played the most significant role in reshaping the collective and cultural identity of the Korean nation in the 20th century. Through its fierce confrontation with the suffering under the consequences of the war, Koreans were to recognize or redefine their collective identity. It was firstly the Donghak Peasant Revolution and the following wars, such as the First Sino-Japanese War between 1894 and 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 and to 1905. But the most important war, the series of the wars waged by the Japanese imperialism outside of the Korean territory during its colonial rule between 1910 and 1945 in Korea. While the Japanese imperialism waged its war in Manchuria and in the Asian Pacific region, the Korean peninsula served a very specific function as a military logistics base. This required that colonialization and the exploitation in the colony were to be executed with highly rationalized structure and institutions, which sometimes are depicted as the core value of the modernity. The laying out of nationwide railroad was another important instrument for this purpose. Here, we observe once more that the modernity or the modernization cannot have a value-neutral meaning in political sense. The colonial power monopolized the definition of the modernization by equating it with the Japanization or assimilation with the Japanese culture. In itself, very modern project of building radio stations was not very different. The establishment of imperium-wide radio stations in, for example, Gyeongsang Bangsonguk in Seoul, by the Japanese colonial governor in 1927 contributed to this monopolization process. Radio stations served to expand and stabilize the absolute power of the imperialism Japan over the colonized Korea by synchronizing discourses and rhetorics between Japan and Korea. But there were even more radical cultural, or put it better, anti-cultural projects which aimed to abolish cultural heritages in Korea. Just to name a few, there was the prohibition of using Korean language in public schools, institutions, and publications. It was a measure between 1938 till the end of the Second World War and 1945. Or the Soshi Kaimei measure, in Korean Changshi Gaemyeong, to obsolete the Korean family names entirely and replace them with invented Japanese family name. Nevertheless, such anti-cultural political and military measures can be also understood as cultural instrument and process, since they reframed and reinvented the mentality and self-understanding of the Korean through time. Part 4. Culture, arts, and the avant-garde in the colonized Korea. So, we are nearing the aesthetic domain. Let us remind that many of the diverse and heterogeneous groups of the avant-garde movement emerged in the first half of the 20th century. The arrival of the Western arts or art philosophy, styles, and practice in the early 20th century Korea was not, however, only of purely aesthetic nature. It was for Korea and many other countries in Asia and other non-European parts of the world was the era of the colonialism and the imperialism. This made inevitable that various aesthetic styles and movements from the 19th and 20th century Europe received additional socio-political characteristics which sometimes were not foreseen in their original context. Especially, the relationship between aesthetic styles and movement and the context of the critical disputes between them, as well as the attempts to overcome prevailing artistic approach, were indeed introduced, but did not become the main object of attention. There can be several ways of describing this unusual constellation. Please allow me to use the comparison with the Russian film director and theorist Sergei Eisenstein. He was using this montage technique, as you might well know. As a recipient, you are confronted with a series of individual images, but they are being exempted from their original context. You are to observe and experience them in a newly projected and produced image and the meaning as a whole. Such an initial position could be interpreted as a weakness or even a deficiency, or it can also be interpreted and actively used to build a different and more creative approach thanks to the critical distance of the observer. Without becoming entirely absorbed in the debate structure of the Western aesthetics and art history, the artists, authors, and thinkers of the 19th century and 20th century in East Asian countries examined and experimented with the new art concept from the contemporary Europe. The most influential contribution of the avant-garde movement in Korean aesthetics in broad sense can be found in literature, above all in poetry. Inspired by Dada and certain aspects, especially the machine aspects of the futurism, the great poet Lee Sang achieved a monumental status in the entire modern aesthetics of Korea. The poet and novelist, born in 1910 and died in 1937 with age of 26 after a political detention in a jail in Tokyo, not only revealed his accomplishment in his understanding of the formal aspects of Dada and Surrealism, he could also masterfully show that his poetic form was the most suitable one to expose and deliver the uncanny character of his times, uncanny as unheimlich in Freud. For he was able to express the uncanny contrast between the belief of the progress and the reality of the oppression par excellence. His poems still deliver the tension between the ideal of the aesthetic freedom and the colonial reality, between the burden of the traditional aesthetics and the irony to find its redemption in the very tradition of the imperialistic Western world, but without being political explicitly. The poet Yhee was also an architect and was a part of the relatively small avant-garde group in the colonized Korea. Although the avant-garde literally meant vanguard or leading foregroup of an army, its role in the modernization process or westernization process was far from being a leading one if we limit our question to the realm of the visual arts. It might lie in the difference of the media character between the literature or printed media and the arts, where the reproducibility of the printed works helped the 20s and 30s of 20th century, one of the important decades of the Korean literature history. Nevertheless, the avant-garde movement in visual arts still had an important symbolic value by representing the anticipated but absent idealized freedom of free thinking, feeling, and living individuals in oppressive colonial society. In visual arts, it was characteristic that many artists from colonized Korea went abroad to Japan to study the modern concepts, techniques, and trends of the Western arts during the colonial period. More than 40 Koreans went to Japan to enroll themselves in the official Tokyo Academy of Arts. Even more Korean artists visited private art school in Japan. Around 150 Korean artists visited private art schools since 1930s until 1945. Only a few artists, however, were deeply involved with the new currents in Japan, which were the abstract arts and the surrealism. The still living and working painter Kim Byung-gi, born in 1916, was one of these few Korean artists. Not only does he belong to the first Western art generations, he was also one of the few active members of the so-called Avant-Garde Western Arts Institute, Avant-Garde Yanghwa 연구소, which renamed itself as SPA, Salon de Plantin Peinture Academy. The key figure of the institute was the Japanese-French painter and printmaker Leonard Chuguharu Fujita, who engaged himself in the institute primarily as a teacher. This institute played the role of gathering other young avant-garde artists from Korea and Japan, such as Kim Hwan-gi, who would be one of the most important abstract painters after the end of the Second World War in South Korea. Part 5. Political division and war on the Korean Peninsula. The end of the World War II was followed by the political division of the peninsula by the international strong powers, and the beginning of the Cold War in Korea was ironically marked by the outbreak of the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. This so-called forgotten war in studies of history was in truth an international war with 25 participating nations and over 30 million casualties and losses. The perpetuating division after the temporary truce or military amnesties in Korea laid a deep mark in the cultural and aesthetic domains too. From a neutral view of an art historian, it might be interesting to observe and examine how artists from the same avant-garde art school prior to the Second World War had to undergo very different circumstances and develop different paths after the division either in a totalitarian pseudo-communist society in the North Korea, or under the authoritarian military dictatorship in the capitalist South Korea until its re-democratization in the late 1980s. Please let me briefly comment only on the situation in South Korea further. It is also true that these historical backgrounds caused not only the existence crisis and suffering of many artists, but also provided them with a new ground for rethinking the meaning of practicing arts. The so-called Minjung arts, or the people's arts, was a good example which had a good influence in the 1980s democratization movement. Apart from the recent attempt to re-evaluate and reappreciate the aesthetic language of Minjung arts, I would like to maintain that they were at the same time representing still unsolved dilemmas of the art concepts and practice since the beginning of the modern era in Korea. The historical and socio-political changes, especially the forced westernization and colonialism, as well as the centralized and nationalistically driven rebuilding of the nation states after the end of Korean War, framed artists with this hard-to-solve dilemma. They were supposed to represent the political reality by their works, and at the same time, they were expected to practice and establish the autonomy of arts. In this context, another challenge for the contemporary art in Korea for the future should be the task to become adequate media to deliver and experiment with the mostly diverse and plural cultural identities of Koreans now. While the political reunification of Korea will concentrate on re-establishing unity by defining common grounds between two long divided Koreas, the cultural and aesthetic domain should and will be able to offer more capacity and cultural sensibility to the Koreans living in the multicultural and globalized present. I would like to call this task achieving cultural reunification in diversity. One might ask if this task is not beyond the aesthetic domain. To answer it just briefly, I would like to refer to the expression die konkrete Allgemeinheit or the concrete Universalität, universality, by Friedrich Hegel, who argued that it is the very task and meaning of the aesthetic spirit to convey this specific understanding of the universality. So, by returning to the suggested title of this presentation, I would like to wrap up my talk. It is indeed difficult to answer which kind of the consequences the avant-garde had in Korea. But I think it is at least as much important to answer a slightly different question. Of which kind of consequences could the avant-garde be in Korea? Neither the westernization nor the modernization was the consequences of the avant-garde art in Korea. But the avant-garde arts, revisited and reshaped by recent Korean artists, can be the consequences of the modernization if we understand the freedom, the individuality, and the autonomy as its core values. In this way, we could continue our previous efforts to define the core value of the modernity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. you already point to many questions in your presentation, and thank you for this sum up. Is actually for Polish audience and for Polish researcher who looking for the avant-garde movements in Poland, especially after the Second World War, and the question of universum and finding the common core. It's very opening. So I would like to opening the Q&A. If you have any comments, any questions, you would like to go further in subjects, please wave a hand and I will come to you with a microphone. If not, may I allowed to ask a question? Then you pointed that there is. We can agree that the consequences of avant-garde in the Western world are followed through modernization, transition, etc. In Korea, which you proved in your lecture, it was avant-garde was a consequences of westernization and modernization, even if it's colonial domination per se. So my question is, how you will recognize then the role of artists who are involved in the avant-garde movements in shaping the political condition, if they had any influences in the political and political sphere, or they were minority in politics of culture in Korea at that time?
Yeah, thank you for the very important and good question. It would be, of course, more interesting if you can say that they are also playing a significant role in political sense, but actually they are, I think they are more of a minority, but not only in the political sense, but also in the sense of, in the meaning of the aesthetics. So that's why I had to elaborate a little bit more on this poet Isang or other medias which are not strictly speaking in the realm of the aesthetics. They were more of cultural medias because they had more more important role, yeah, in for the process of modernization in Korea.
Because in the previous lectures and as well you pointed that a few times that I had this notion that in shaping the modern or I don't want to use the word Western because it's very dominant and very colonial term, Westernization, but nonetheless the modernization of culture in Korea went through medias, radio, newspapers, which was slightly different as it was in for example, in Eastern Europe during the 20s and 30s, where those medias were visible, they were important, but they were shaped by the artists. Artists used them to communicate their manifestos, communicated their thoughts. They had a very significant political and cultural role. So I imagine that in Korea, the media could be this notion of progressive avant-garde movements, but they were not used by the artists, as I understand. Yes, or I'm wrong.
I wouldn't say that is totally incorrect what you just said. Yeah, actually, it's a very typical constellation, and I was trying to depict it by using or comparing it to the collage or montage technique by Eisenstein, in the sense that there was a context in the European history of media and communication technology and also in aesthetics, but this context was not received as it were because they came all the same time, and it was you had this possibility to choose which one you want to use more appropriately for your own purpose. So sometimes it was actually very possible, and there are some important literary figures who were producing and publishing some new newspapers or more of some small scale literature bulletins. But it was not, it was at many cases the other way around.
Thank you. Is now if you do you have any thoughts to share or questions? Yep.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. I'm Korean, but I'm curious. As you mentioned, some artists went to Japan to study avant-garde or other part. And as far as I know, Yoon Dongju also went to Japan to study. So some researchers guess he may change his name in Japanese way because he want to go there. So I guess I think there's I wonder, is there any political suggestion or promotion from Japanese government, or they just choose to Japan because Japan is very close to study Western cultural art? It's so nervous because I'm not familiar with this subject, but I wonder, yes.
I appreciate also very interesting question. Actually, I was wondering while I was preparing these papers, because I saw some ambivalence. Yeah? And so some of the young artists who are very interested in this new avant-garde movement had very liberal and tendencies in their political views, but this very teacher who played a significant role in this avant-garde institute in Japan, Yama 연구소, he was also later accused of being cooperative with the Japanese rule and imperialism, and it was a very ambivalent history. So, but at the same time, so it can be interpreted in both ways, yeah? Because there are some reports of the Korean young artists at the time that the Japanese, especially those Japanese groups with tendency to receive and experiment more with this avant-garde movement, they are more open to the Korean young artists than other Japanese groups. So I think there is some space to research more. Thank you.
Any other? So last but not least, I guess, do you agree or not with the notion that avant-garde art or avant-garde movements, because not only art, as you pointed, the literature as well, can be recognized as cultural resistance of Japanese domination? Because we talk about like 20s, 30s, so the time when the avant-garde appears was very in a strong notion. And then you mentioned this people's art. Yes, and from what you said, I have this notion that they actually made their art and art language as a language of resistance. So do you agree that in Korea in specific, avant-garde movements could be recognized as movements of resistance, cultural resistance?
Also very interesting question. I think it can be, the answer can be very varied, and it's a very typical question when you are reading Adorno. Yeah? So doing the most pure art and avant-garde, you are achieving the most possible resistance. Yeah? If you are agree with Adorno's view, then you can of course say that. Yeah? But many artists of the of this age under the Japanese rule or not agreeing with this, and because there was also very fierce dispute between the Korean artists, yeah, and mostly not only the artists, visual artists, but more the writers. Yeah, there are severe, and there is you can almost say that it shows the omens which you will observe later in the poetic realm, but it began earlier in literature and aesthetics. So, and it was also the beginning of the so-called pure art. Yeah, so the high art is a very important dispute in Korean literature history. Yeah, so it's up to your position. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just add a few words in terms of visual art? Well, the Western style painters in Korea appears in 1910, Go Hee-dong, and as he mentions during the lecture, the most of the significant, important, the modern to contemporary artists were studied in Japan, and they brought abstractions to Korea. That is the main kind of stream in visual art. So it developed into two branches after that. So one is purely Western style abstractions, and the other way is some painters who painted in Korean traditional painting, they tried to imply the abstraction into Korean style. So two branches just developed up to 1970s, we can say. And then 1980s, actually the moments when we have the art movements, is linked with academism as well, because many of the Korean painters who studied in Japan, they got a higher position and they were a foundation for the modern to contemporary art in Korea. But we had kind of the national prize and the other kind of and problems as well about the academism. So there are the people who wants to have different formats into them. So maybe the consequences of avant-garde in visual arts, the format of the Japanized Western style is very important, which we can call as abstractions.
Thank you very much. If there is any other questions, Ginny, thank you very much for once again for your talk and for coming to Warsaw, especially for that. Our audience, thank you for attending, and right now I'm inviting you for next week at the same place at 6 o'clock. We'll have not the lecture but the discussion of interpretation of Marcel Duchamp in Korean art, and we will have a special guest, one of the artists who is participating in the show, curator itself, plus director of Ujazdowski Castle, who attended as well. So you are more than welcome to visit us next week, the same time in this room. Thank you very much and have a lovely evening.